I was the project manager at the time of these organizations that helped these people on the street. Right?
Yeah.
This was my job.
Yeah. And still, you're thinking the car. Now, that's a good option at this point because there was nothing else available. Hey there. If you've joined the podcast today, my name is Chris Jarvis. I work with companies on employee giving and volunteering programs.
And my name's Jake McIsaac. I spend a lot of time thinking about public safety and restorative justice.
So we are having conversations here that we've been having for 20 years.
Yeah, the only difference now is we press record and share it with you.
Thanks for joining us. On today's episode, we're going to talk to a friend of mine from Portland, Oregon, a city that is experiencing a lot of issues around homeless or unhoused neighbors, similar to what we discussed in the Maritime provinces a couple episodes ago. His name is Andy Reid. He's got firsthand experience on both sides of the equation. He's great insights, and he's very knowledgeable.
I'm still trying to figure out what's love got to do with any of this.
Well, I think he nails that towards the end, so let's find out.
Okay.
Hey, Jake, I thought we should follow up on our promise from our previous episode.
Which one?
Continue to discuss our unhoused neighbors, housed neighbors, how they get along. And I thought we should get an interesting story, firsthand source material for this conversation.
Okay.
So I'm happy to introduce another guest. We are so good on our follow through. We promised to be doing this for everybody this year, and we have had a number of guests. We'll have some more. Andy Reid, a friend. I would consider. Andy, would you consider us friends?
Thank you.
I'm looking at him. Yeah,
it's okay, Andy, if you say no.
You don't feel forced.
It actually makes for a better podcast.
It's frankly, it's been more of a crush on my part, Chris. So
no, it's going the wrong way.
We have been talking for years, and I finally got a chance to do a little project with Andy, and he's going to tell us a little bit about it. But Andy Reid from Portland, Oregon, thrilled to have you on the show with us today. Could you just share a little bit about who you are, where you are, what you do? We'll dig into it. Andy's got a great story. I can't wait to talk about it with everyone.
Thanks, guys. I am. I'll start with kind of my most important identity. I'm a father and a husband. I've got 3 kiddos. It's where I spend the bulk of my time and energy is trying to raise them to do right by the world. That's first and foremost. I work in an economic development organization. We do work for the city of Portland, and our job is to help companies to grow and to become more inclusive. And so that looks like a lot of things. Growth for growth's sake isn't really quite the space we want to go. We discovered as an organization at Prosper Portland that we needed to lean pretty heavily into the inclusion piece back in 2015. And since then, we call ourselves an anti-racist organization, which causes some issues, frankly, because of our history of being one of the organizations that did a lot of dismantling of communities, gentrification. We were at the heart of that for many, many years of racist practice. So
you mean the government of Portland or the administrative bodies historically?
That's correct.
Yeah, I don't think many people know that in Canada. The Canadian audience wouldn't know that Oregon was historically somewhat founded on or by individuals who held fairly prejudicial beliefs.
Absolutely. Our school system was designed by the KKK. So
there you go. Okay.
And it just takes years to unpack.
You just cut right to it.
Bullseye. There you go. That's it. Like if I was going to say the most extreme version might be if you invited the KKK in to teach your children. Or set it all up. That
here we go.
Would that ever happen anywhere? I actually didn't know that, Andy. That's pretty wild. And so you're in Portland. Did you grow up in Oregon?
I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in the middle of one of the poorest communities that was redlined through these government and community and business efforts to keep African Americans in particular out of certain parts of the city. So that's where I lived as a kid, growing up in the middle of the gang wars and the Crips and the Bloods and the crack houses. And
okay, so I'm sitting with Andy and we're having a beer after the event that we had, where we're talking about how do we create in Portland a more inclusive supply chain for companies. Afterwards, we go to have this beer and we're talking, and he drops this line. I grew up Crips and Bloods. I'm like, wait, Portland, Oregon. had this as a reality. Now, this is hard on the heels of, if you've not seen images, downtown Portland is quite full of unhoused neighbors who are living in tents. And anyways, all of this led to an interesting conversation. But before we go any further, for those who are thinking, what is redlining? Why do you keep mentioning it?
Well, I don't know if I'll get there, but I still back on trying to imagine. See, because my recent images of Portland were from, as a Canadian, post George Floyd, and defund police, and a whole,
Right.
communities saying, demanding a different experience of justice and law enforcement, public safety, like really large scale demonstrations and whole blocks of cities, just
for a long period of time.
Long
as well.
time, a
Just
sustained
yeah.
Movement. It felt like. So watching, I'm kind of interested in that. Before we get to the other stuff, is what has that been like?
Yeah, and how's the situation now? Like, what's the fallout been?
It is a hard time. It's a hard time for a lot of cities on the West Coast, I think. Feeling the hangover of COVID, I think, is maybe still accurate. We have businesses that have gone fully remote. We have those that have gone in 2 days a week, and so you have a pretty quiet city. The business community is responding to the marketplace and doing what they need to do with their employees. Employees are demanding a different way of doing business, and so
it's still hard to find employees too, right? Like a lot of businesses
and it's
are
still hard
capacity.
to find employees. And getting that from a number of companies saying, I just can't get the workforce that I need. So it's a strange time. That said, having been to a number of places around the world and experiencing, extreme poverty, like seeing it in other places, having some tents on the sidewalk, it doesn't bother me, but that's, right. I can walk the streets. That said, some people do feel that safety is still like kind of the number one issue that needs to be dealt with. And
that's a really interesting angle that I hope we can visit, which is the visibility of unhoused neighbors make those people who have housing feel unsafe, which is interesting. My first reaction isn't for their safety; it's their unhoused, unsafe situation makes me feel afraid for myself. And there's a lot of bias about this community and whatnot, but that's what we want to unpack today. And you said when I was in Portland, there were streets and streets with tents on the sidewalks and whatnot. And then I've just been in Colorado in same situation, streets lined with tents, people living outside, and the city came along, put boulders on the sidewalk to make it a little bit more uncomfortable. However, that made for a nicer camping situation because you had better ways to tie up your belongings and that kind of thing. So it actually produced the opposite effect. Yeah. Well, we all are
because they're surviving. I mean, I think that what might be most threatening is that you have folks who are making it and getting by right next to people who don't have to make these hard decisions every day. And I wonder if that's what is unsettling and upsetting and scary for folks, is that they just don't know what's next. How far will someone go to survive? And so we've seen this around some of the encampments around Halifax, and where I'm at is the neighbors directly in close proximity to these encampments really start to have a rhetoric around, you don't know what's next. There's this foreboding fear that someone could, right now they're outside of my yard, but maybe they're going to come in. What stops them from coming into my house? And they catastrophize. So, Andy, you said something about that I hadn't thought of until you kind of said it. You're saying about the COVID hangover, lots of people working from home, and it just dawned on me the range of assumptions that lots of folks have made when they decided to shut down businesses, that people had homes to work from. Like there's probably a whole bunch of folks who we don't know actually what their living situations are. And they're existing next to us in offices and keeping it afloat day to day. But does that resonate with some of the things that you see?
Well, now I think we're getting close to Andy's story, actually. Yeah, that kind of situation.
Well, as you're describing that, I was looking at some UNICEF data, and I've been watching the displacement trends for years because I work in this area, and Ukraine obviously kicked things up into high gear again. 3 years ago, we were at like 60 million, 65 million displaced in the globe. You're living in camps in different places, not in their homes, as I described, being displaced. Now we're over 100 million.
Wow.
So the question of like, who are we, those that are displaced? It really is a much bigger conversation than dudes in a tent on the side of the street in Portland.
Right. And we tend to categorize them as fairly one-dimensional. Alcoholics or narcotic users and just don't want to work.
Yeah, and that isn't the reality.
Right.
The communities that I have moved in and out of, those that are undocumented workers coming up from Mexico, packing 5 to 10 to 15 people into a room because that's what they can afford, or they can't actually rent because they don't have the ability to turn in an application because they don't have any rental history, or they don't have credit scores, all of the systems that prevent a person who is trying to make a better life for him or herself to actually do it. And so we scrap our way through life and we figure it out. And yeah, it's for those of us that are in homes that are comfortable with the keys and the locks and the things. If you don't have and know that experience, but I would say that there are many people in the United States that do have that experience. They've had to move through the refugee camps. They've had to leave domestic violence situations. They've had this is not an uncommon experience, I think.
Right, which is exactly why you're on the show. It's an unexpected story, especially given your current role and your current work, how you look and the assumptions I would make just looking at you. You have had an experience with not having a place to live of sorts. You made it work. Because this is what's interesting, is to explore how this reality can happen given the right situation to almost everybody.
I feel like kind of rounding out the edges a little bit of context is maybe helpful.
Yeah,
the facts of losing my home, there are things around that. But as I looked back at this conversation around how does somebody end up in a situation? How did I end up in a situation where I find myself unhoused for 5 years?
5 years.
5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was the Great Recession. Do we even talk about that anymore? The Great Recession of 2008.
Yeah, we're by it. We're like, what's the next big thing that we can destroy?
We've moved on.
We've moved on too easily.
The context is, and I appreciate your emphasis on the brain and the neuro side of things. I think about my childhood and growing up in a family that we were just in a situation that was really difficult. The medical systems kind of forced us to stay in poverty.
Yeah.
My sister had a number of, I think she's had 30, 35 surgeries by this point. And so all the resources went to kind of care for her, as they should.
And at one point, you identified that your dad made slightly too much money. Just slightly.
He crossed the threshold of the federal poverty level, which then forced them to take my sister out of the ICU with her face wired shut.
Oh my gosh.
Because it's either you pay the medical bill or you take. And so I don't know if the medical systems would ever do this now, but back then they're like, pay your bill or take her out of the ICU. That was like,
that's
like,
rough.
What do you do?
That's right. And it wasn't like your dad got double the amount. He just was, the poverty level is so low and he made just a little bit too much.
It's like $12,000 a year or something for a family of 5.
Oh my gosh. So now you're getting further behind because you moved ahead too little.
$5 over the limit, right?
$5, Jake. $5, you're out. Now you owe 50.
That's
Take
bananas.
that 5 and pay us 50.
Yeah, the math just breaks down, right?
Oh, right. Pretty quick.
Logic. Yeah.
So having that experience of, and I don't know the right words, call it extreme poverty. We scrapped our way through it, thinking about like homelessness and, watching people, figure out how to throw together their little home with their tent and their tarps and whatever. And like you said, tying to the boulders, much easier. You have a point of connection. So we dumpster dove. We were gleaners. If you know the word gleaner, it's a good one.
Yeah,
that's how we
much
ate.
Better than dumpster diving. Oh, Andy, how old are you at this point?
Those between the age of 5 and 15, we kind of just survive. So I started working when I was 9. That was when I got my first job, and really kind of haven't ever stopped since. But the deep side of that is the emotional trauma of being the other. So I knew that I was poor.
Right.
And I knew that those around me weren't. And I didn't know what it looked like and felt like to be in the other side.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew what it was like to feel poor. And then when you're in, I think about like the margins, the marginalized, like I was kind of visualizing it last night, the piece of paper, and you can move the margins to pack more words on a piece of paper if you want to, and you're writing your college papers or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's
or
like
the other way around.
the margins, or the other way around, right? Less, right? I never did that. So I think about like the marginalized, and this is how I kind of visualize my own childhood, is those on the edge. We're the ones on the edge.
Yeah.
And so just kind of think about like if I'm on a cliff and I'm on the edge of a cliff and the wind blows, you don't have margin. You go over the cliff.
Yeah, you're right there. Yeah, that's a good visual. Yeah, that's right. Wow.
So if you do have margin, you step back 10 feet, the wind blows, you get knocked over, you scrape up your knees, maybe you get a little dirty, but then you pick up and you move again, right?
Yeah, you're still on the playing field or paper.
You're still on the paper, right?
Yeah.
That was my kind of experience in life, as being on the margins for many, many years and trying to figure out how to get more into the middle. And we didn't have the tools to get into the middle. We didn't have the resources to get into the middle.
Okay, what does that mean? Like, so this is one of you've already mentioned a couple of things that break the trope, right? The stereotype. One, a job at 9 and working in the mines ever since, not the literal mines, but
berry fields, but yes.
Berry fields. There you go. 2, toughing it out with a family that's somewhat intact, so not destroyed kind of thing. And then thirdly, very interested in moving ahead and constantly the tenacity and the temerity to think that you could do that. All of these things sort of break the stereotype that's propagated, which is, why they're homeless or struggling, lazy, don't want to work, no ambition, those people. So you're getting all of that othering, but it's not actually true. It's not who you are.
Mm-mm. And as I've unpacked this even deeper, I'll get to my homeless story in a minute.
Yeah.
But what then I did experience was the flip side of it, being a white male in communities. When I finally made it to a school that had resource, I was set up. I was taken care of. All the systems aligned to what I needed. I ended up with all of the scholarships, all of free food at school. They waived my sports fees. I got discounted instruments. I got everything I needed to actually make the switch. Now, emotionally and mentally, there was still trauma that needed to get dealt with, which kind of leads into my houselessness story. But the physical care, the Maslow's hierarchy, basic stuff was given to me. And I can say my experience with my friends at college, that's not how many of them had this. They didn't have the same experience I did in getting out of the difficulties because of, again, my white privilege, basically. It's kind of set me up there. So
Jake,
that's also true.
Yeah, right. And Jake and I work in Halifax. One of the things I think that was biggest learning for me because I didn't know what I didn't know as we started to do, say, the Sunday suppers at St. Andrews, was that it was a meal where everybody came, like men and women and their kids and little families, and they would come from across the city just to recognize this condition or these issues can come into anybody's life if the circumstances are right.
One of the things, Andy, as I'm listening to you, and I really appreciate what you just said about, getting to the school and the system. The system was in place. Once you could access it, it kind of lifted and did what it was supposed to do in many ways. I often think about these stories, or when we hear it, or I think the Hollywood versions are the individual grit and resiliency of the person. They pulled themselves up. They found a way. And maybe some of that, of course, is true. But I wonder what, maybe you'll get this in the next part as we dig in deeper. But I'm listening for what's the role of community? Like, what would have made a difference in sort of thinking back? But also, what is the role of the people who are around? So you're in community of some sort, I'm guessing. How does that help or make a difference?
I appreciate you bringing that up. My wife the other day, we were kind of reframing my childhood story just in another way. And she said, Andy, Portland raised you. And I was like, what do you
Yeah.
mean? She said, Portland raised you because she's heard all my stories. And when I'm being chased by the gang kids with their baseball bats and trying to steal my bike or whatever, we had these signs on the windows, which allowed us to like literally run into the house without knocking on the door. Like
Oh
they're
yeah, yeah.
safe
What
houses,
good
basically.
neighbor
Yeah.
or what was
Neighborhood
it?
Yeah.
watch or whatever we had here.
Yeah, I remember that when I was a kid too. Yeah.
So I would literally run into the house. Hey, can you call my parents? And they're like, no problem. Like this was normal, right?
Huh.
So community, that's like one slice of community, an example of how even though we were all on the margin in Northeast Portland. And so, but they raised me, and we had a very strong community that took care of each other. We ate because people opened food pantries in their basements. That the community took care of us. The churches put us on the trees, like.
Yeah. How did that come across? Like there's a story. Who's the big guru in self-help? What's his name? A big, tall fella. Anthony Robbins tells a story, and he's right. He's talking about how nothing means anything. We bring meaning to it. It's actually very scientifically accurate. But he grew up a similar situation to you, Andy. I don't know if you knew this. And one Christmas, they were like, no food. His dad is angry. The family's feeling desperate. They knock on the door, big box, brought it in. And the dad lost it. Like he just erupted in anger because all he thought in this moment felt was shame. He felt this was degrading. People shouldn't do this. It was like pointing a spotlight on his failure. Whereas Chowney said, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. Like we're not going to die. Completely different way of seeing it. And so in this situation, how did your dad react? Like what was you were as a kid were thinking, okay, I'm not alone. There's houses I can run to. People bring food. Churches put our little names on their Christmas trees and we get looked after. But was this a point of stress as well for your parents? Beyond just not having enough to make it, but even being helped?
I don't know. I'd have to ask. I haven't asked them that question. If it was a point of stress for them. I know, they've always been some of the kindest, most giving people in the world. And I think they learned that from what they experienced. So it's that they're in that same kind of class of people of they will give you the shirt off their back when they don't have it, which has taught me to give generously as much as I can. Like, this is my whole, like my highest value is that.
Yeah, your internalized value, you determine how you see and the meaning that you ascribe to different situations. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you ended up in a car down the river.
So I think you nailed it with the word shame, though. That's an important one as part of the story. So 2008, I had been accumulating real estate. I had some houses and condos. I was creating wealth for my family. And, without getting too deep into the story of what happened, my wife at the time and I split up. And I had a couple of major catastrophes with the houses, and all of the margin, all the money I'd saved to deal with pipes breaking, things like that.
Yeah.
It got gobbled up, gone.
Flipping houses is very, very risky. Yeah. It was risky. Speaking of no margin. Yeah.
So that was a poor choice to do.
Well, okay. if it worked out, we'd all be like, "Oh, you're such a success! Look at what you did. Your industry." Yeah.
But I tie it back to my childhood, like wanting something more because of that scarcity mentality of like, I don't have enough. I never had enough.
Yeah.
Never had enough.
Yeah.
And so I saw this opportunity kind of running up to the 2008 recession and housing bust. I was like, I can buy real estate. This is amazing. And
because anybody at the time could buy.
They were giving me 0 down loans. Yeah. It was happening. So my wife and I split. She's home with our 1-year-old in our house, and I don't have enough. She's staying home with our kiddo, and I don't have enough to pay rent somewhere else. And as part of this kind of separation, moving to divorce, we also kind of broke up friendships and all of those things that we had kind of our community around us splintered.
Because you have to choose one or the other. You can't be friends with both. We've all seen that Seinfeld
Right.
episode.
It's the Seinfeld.
Yeah.
It's a Seinfeld episode.
Because I'm looking
right.
at Jay, because we have talked about this. Let's go with this person. Yeah.
So we made decisions of like who are going to be your friends and who are going to be mine. And it was like this very trite, like, wow, okay. So I crawl back to my parents and I'm like, Mom and Dad, I need help. I don't know. But we had also we needed to work through some stuff ourselves. So, I'm 30 and I'm not gonna move back in with them. Plus they were too far away from work, and emotionally I couldn't handle being in a house with them. So that was just, again, kind of the underbelly of all this whole thing.
Right.
So they called a friend, and the friend said, yeah, I've got a vacant house that my mom just died in. You can move in here for a little bit, but will you remodel it while you're there? Okay. Because I have flipping houses.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Fair trade. So vacant house, I've got a room full of stuff, whatever could fit in my car. That one wraps up. Call my parents again. Hey, do you know anybody else? Oh, we've got a friend named Tom, a World War II vet. His wife just dies. So now I'm like moving into these houses.
Oh my goodness.
Of like random
pattern. Yeah. Hey, Mom and Dad, let's just cut to it. Has anybody passed lately? Like that's really.
I'm just gonna need some. Yeah.
Oh, no.
So this happens maybe, I'm going to say 5 times.
Yeah.
I have no money. I have 2 jobs. I'm teaching at a university and I have an economic development job. I'm working these jobs.
Okay, those jobs don't fit your circumstances. Do they know about your situation? No. It's not like you're walking around saying, hey,
No, I would not tell. I did not have a boss that was one that I could share these kinds of things with.
Wow.
And so nobody at work knew. Nobody knew that I was homeless at the time. Once all of the hey mom and dad phone calls wrapped up and I didn't have any more connections and all my friendships had kind of moved on, I ended up in my car. I have no other options. I don't know what else to do at this point.
Right. And you are in the space now at this point where you could, well, now it's dial 211 or whatever it is. If you needed to find resources, it would feel like you have the competencies to do that.
I managed programs. Funded programs, millions of dollars to nonprofits to help them serve the homeless community. Like I was the project manager at the time of these organizations that helped these people on the street. Right. Yeah. So this was my job.
Yeah. And still you're thinking the car. Now that's a good option at this point because there was nothing else available. Realistically.
And so it goes to this, like, so there's shame. There's a lot of shame, like who and what the hell happened? I'm thinking this to myself, like, how did I get here?
Yeah.
And as I see as somebody who's on the street, I often think to myself, like, what happened in their life that led to like something big, some kind of trauma, little T, big T, something happened where this is their best option. And which is where this was my best option. I had a clothesline in the back of my 1993 Ford Explorer and I hung up my dress shirts and I showered at work and that was my best option. Like that's...
For how long?
Oh, I don't know. It was a few months. Yeah.
Wow.
So you've described the conditions, but you've said you've revisited shame a few different times. What's the antidote to shame in this particular situation? But I'm wondering, like, if people who we encounter might be experiencing the world the same way, full of shame, which is now a barrier to accessing services and support. If we were working sort of the other side now, knowing this, having heard from you, knowing that people may be experiencing this, what should we do? How should we respond? What would have helped?
Shame can go into a couple different directions. You can take it into the addiction space. Like you start covering your shame. Mm-hmm. You feel so horrible that you are unlovable in your mind as somebody who experiences deep shame.
Yeah.
And so like, okay, I'll just drink, or I'll use meth or whatever. And that will make it, or, pick your addiction. There's all kinds of stuff out there, right? Addiction services, I think, are really important to make sure, like those organizations that I've spent time with that do it well in the community space usually attach some kind of mental health piece to it. So that's one side of it. I think, the faith community needs to be heavily involved in this work. And I've got issues with them, like a lot of people. And yet they have a community that can lift things up as well when done well. when done with empathy, with inclusion, I think they need to be involved on some level. This isn't a government problem to solve. It's a community problem to solve.
Yeah. We talk about that all the time. Policing, safety, all of that. And for us, one of the things that came out, well, and I think it's how you framed it, Jake. It's how you framed it with housed and unhoused. And since then, I've been trying to meet and talk to unhoused neighbors in my community to just learn their name, ask a little bit about where they stay and that kind of thing, just to begin to address this issue that you've raised, which is just this feeling of lack of dignity. I'm unlovable. I'm the other. And that is just horrific. Yeah. On both sides, because the house neighbors think, yeah, you're right. You are the other. I would like you out of my neighborhood because you don't belong here. But who knows, how many people on the street have this kind of very unique story to say, this is how we got here. Because if we heard those stories, I think a lot of us would think, if one thing had been different in my life, I could see this for me as well. And finding myself in this kind of strange reality. So if you were imagining an Andy Reid in downtown Portland right now in a tent on a sidewalk, and you were walking by, okay, so you're two people in this weird little analogy. You were walking by. How do you talk to Andy at that point in a way that is dignified and it kind of addresses the compounding issues on top of the shame in a way that is helpful?
I mean, super basic. I make eye contact.
Yeah.
First, period.
Yeah.
Like, start that for 6 months. Just try to make eye contact with people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy. To jump on your line here a little bit, there's a woman here every time I walk by, and she, sort of a shorter Black woman, maybe in her 50s. I could tell she knew some folks in the neighborhood, but every time I walk by, she gave me the squinty stink eye, right? Like, I don't know you. Because I'd look at her in the eyes and say, hello. I wasn't sure what her story was. It took like 5 times before she said hello back.
She remembers you, though. She knows who you are, right?
Yeah.
So that's number one, is eye contact. And then the second is a pretty simple one as well. Not simple. How are you doing today?
Yeah, because you can get cursed at. I've been cursed at that question.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But it's okay. That's not.
It's okay.
It's not the point.
I would say that I mean, this is me speaking to me because you gave me that scenario.
Right.
It's different if you are, I'm a larger 6'1", 200-pound guy. I'm not small. And maybe it's different if I am, a woman trying to walk down the street in Portland. It's just going to be a different story. There are just gender issues, things to deal with, safety issues, things like that. So, and, with that whole thing, I don't know what the numbers are. It's something like 1 in 6 women have been sexually assaulted in their lives. So you have the othering of women, right? Like, that story is true as well. And so it's not that, like, go say hi to every person who's on the street. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, in our scenario, for me, this is what I would do, but I can't say that every person has to take that same path.
Do you feel it would have been helpful to have sort of after saying hi and passing you a few times, that you would ever say, hey, do you know about this place to stay, or like to be proactive in problem solving and jumping in on?
I mean, just thinking back to the moments, and there were stressful times, and again, I just felt a lot of shame about, how did I end up here? Like, I shouldn't be here. Right. I've made it out of poverty. I should not be sleeping in my car. What happened?
Yeah.
And so I didn't make eye contact. Like, I didn't want to look at people.
Yeah.
So there's also that, right?
I wonder the play that's happening in that scenario too, between shame and guilt. So if the person going by, I mean, there's this immediate need to fix in some situations. So instead of getting to know, it's, let me give the money, let me take you to get a sandwich, let me get into the fixing, you must be hungry, and make a range of assumptions about what this must be like. But I need to do something, because confronted with this makes me feel uncomfortable. So I have to do something. Otherwise I have to be more reflective about why I feel guilty, or why I feel like, that fine line between guilt and gratitude. I think there is a fine line somewhere. And I know I'm very blessed. I have lots of stuff. But in this moment now, I feel really weird about it.
Yeah.
I was really, really thankful on my drive in until
Yeah.
they got to the stop sign and they start squeegeeing my window. And now I'm like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
do I do?
Mhm.
Yep.
I wonder.
Where I have gone in terms of like the systems. So we could focus our energy on the extreme cases, the person living in the tent on the street in Portland. But then we also have, the foster kids, and we have the kids that are
Right.
living in hotels, and we have a whole community that is unhoused that are basically couch surfing. That was a portion of my homelessness, was the couch surfing, living in a vacant building, living in a vacant house. And I think there are many, many of these stories as well. And so when I think about homelessness, houselessness, unhoused, if somebody wants to make an entry into this space and it feels a bit extreme, like I'm not going to go run a marathon for my first run. I'm going to start walking, and
Right.
then maybe I'll go for a 1 mile jog.
Yeah.
Probably going to get a cramp. Going to have to stop and stretch.
It's going to feel terrible.
It's going to feel terrible. And so there are ways to enter the work that are safe for me as somebody who is housed, who needs a slower ramp than just jumping into this massive issue that is way more complex than my $15 sandwich is going to fix. Like,
Right.
it's not going to fix anything.
Well, Chris,
That's not going to fix anything.
You talk about this though in your stages of volunteering. It tracks very similarly.
Yeah.
About
Yeah.
how to get involved in some of the same ways Andy's talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. The first stage of experiential learning or volunteering in our case with employees is to give them an experience where they can just ask new questions about themselves, about what they believe and how they act. Like just, should I be looking at people in the eye when I thought I was supposed to look away. That's what everybody told me, right? Don't make eye contact. They'll want something. So just hearing some of that from somebody who's been there, who knows, you think, wait, this is different. That's first stage. Second stage is, why are there so many homeless? What can I do? You start to intrinsically get motivated to do something about it because there's something in that work that lines up with your own identity and is energizing, even though you're giving, because you're moving from I'm helping those people with their problem to maybe this issue belongs to both of us. And maybe there's an opportunity to learn about it and co-create some solutions together. I mean, nobody in second stage is really that sophisticated, but by the time they get the third stage, they've experienced it. They know what they're talking about. In this issue, Andy, you would be a third stage guide. And since you have this firsthand experiential knowledge and you've been both sides and you are a 6'1" male representing the, iconically the power structure of the United States at this time, what is your assessment now of the situation in Portland in terms of, you don't have to get into the cause of it necessarily. That's historic. But how does a city address the issue in your mind? Because this is tied to how Halifax and Fredericton and other maritime provinces have taken steps, some good, some bad, and everything in between. You've been on both sides. What's the insight that you can leave with our audience to consider?
Access to housing is clearly a major thing. That's going to be first and foremost how cities, I think, respond to this. They're going to throw money at building buildings, creating spaces. I get it. That's a big part of it. We recently did a survey, and I think 50% of the people on the streets in Portland said that they had a mental health issue. So you just start unpacking that, and you realize that without mental health resources, you're not going to make a ton of progress. So
yeah, the housing is not going to work. Yeah, that's a tool for a different life.
It's a tool.
Not a solution. Yeah.
And I worked with people in these housing projects, just I think of a woman who came from the East Coast to the West Coast, and she had escaped prostitution, and just leaving her room was a hard thing to do.
Yeah. Wow.
And we were like writing resumes together. And so like the writing of the resume was not what she needed in that moment. She needed some kindness, love, encouragement. You are safe to come out of your room here. Like, you will be safe. And here's why. Yeah. So that mental health, that piece is, I think, really important. So I would say that if cities want to do something right, they're going to throw money at that. I remember a few years ago, I was looking at some of our statistics, and it was like something like 75% of the men on the street were veterans. And so you start talking about PTSD and all of those things, and what war has done to people. So that's all there. The other thing is, I think poverty is a piece. I'm a big believer in you start with building the systems. This is a 20-year, 30-year problem that we're going to have to work on. So you work with the kiddos, you resource them with good nutrition. Thinking back to my childhood of having to fight to eat and that's insecurity, get kids good food. I don't know if that's like a direct correlation between one and the other, homelessness and kids that are hungry.
But in your estimation, it was part of a scarcity mindset of threat all the time to not have access to food. And it goes to Tony Robbins' source of shame, not being able to provide. I think weirdly, we have way too much of it. And yet it is an easy solution if we could just distribute it more equitably.
That's right. And laws around food. It's an interesting moment. I worked at the Oregon Convention Center, and we would throw away thousands and thousands of pounds of food, tens of thousands of pounds of food, and how just the systems are designed to throw it away, not to use it. And then you get into the environmental impact of all of that. Like it's all connected in many ways. So I think nourishing children, food, emotionally, providing them good structures and systems, support for families. The men that I've talked to in the African American community that came out of the same neighborhood as me, 75% of my friends ended up in prison. So let's talk about that, stepping back to like the laws that moved them towards prison. I think it's a super complex problem. The quick triage mental health piece is really like, if you're going to want to try and make an immediate impact, making sure those resources are abundant, not just available.
Well, interestingly, the first responders to mental health issues in downtown Portland tend to be police and fire.
Right.
Because that's who the house neighbors call. And that gets us back to some of our original conversations, Jake, about police may not be the best trained group to deal with these kind of issues. And yet that's a situation that
may not be.
Yeah. Okay.
Are we still back there
it's
exploring
mental health issue.
that?
Here's your gun and taser. Figure that out. Yeah.
So Andy, when you were talking there, I didn't want to interrupt it. You used a word that threw me off, but I appreciated. You said it wasn't about writing the resume. What you needed was kindness. And then you said love, which I kind of circled that word mentally because I didn't expect to hear it. And it tracks along with where we often talk about taking a human-centered approach and really pushing back against systems that oppress and create these conditions that we're constantly trying to respond to. But I appreciated that because that is something that often we don't think about.
I think that final comment on love is the right one. I just remember sitting with her and we would cry together. Like, I see you. And you're beautiful. You're a beautiful human being. I'm sorry this happened to you. Yeah. Having the empathetic response is really those that have done well, I think, in case management. And it's God's work, my gosh. Sitting in those communities and trying to figure out how to even respond to this is so difficult. Without that space of love and kindness and empathy, we don't have much. Like the systems will fall apart.
And I think that underscores the work that anybody who's privileged enough to have a house, a roof over your head, even if it's only temporary and things may change down the road or whatever, but for right now, to just do the internal work of humanizing the other. Like it's both sides of the equation that need to come together in this. And there's a lot of hard work. I like the analogy. You're going to run a marathon. You have to start with a walk. Just taking a walk around your neighborhood and seeing the unhoused neighbor as a human being. First step. And what does that mean to you? What does that mean to how you act, how you respond? Is there another way to see it other than threat? Why do I other so easily? What does it mean to live in a neighborhood where unhoused and housed live together in community? What kind of sharing and back and forth can happen there? These are the kinds of things that I think we could be doing, even if we can't deconstruct the huge, massive systems next week.
Well, and my final thought is exactly that. We have all been othered.
Yeah.
And we know what it feels like. And it's horrible when it happens. And so if we can tap into that, then maybe we've got a chance to see somebody else as more human than we did before.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for being so vulnerable. And thanks for putting up with Jacob's, intrusive.
I didn't even cry. I was expecting to cry. I usually cry when I talk. So it wasn't too painful.
It was great to have you.
It's been great.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll see you on the next project.
All right. Thank you.
This
has been
a Podstarter
production.